Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us for this conversation about board governance, merging profit and purpose. We're so grateful to our wonderful sponsors, Duchossois Capital Management, who is our forum sponsor of the Professional Services Forum, and to our presenting sponsor, KPMG. I'm going to hand things over to one of our Professional Services Forum co-chairs, Eric Reeves from Duchossois Capital Management, to kick us off on this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. Good morning, everyone. And welcome to our virtual forum event on board governance, merging profit and purpose. Again, my name is Eric Reeves. I'm Managing Director and Head of Private Capital Investments at Duchossois Capital Management. I'm also co-chair of the Executives Club Professional Service Forum, as Megan mentioned. I'm excited to welcome you. I'm excited for a discussion on the changing nature of board governance and the dynamic role that professional service providers play in the execution of board duties. The idea for this discussion came from a lively meeting last fall among members of the Professional Services Forum. And after adjusting to the disruptions of our, quote, new normal, I'm pleased to be bringing this important conversation to you all. From shareholder activism to fiduciary discipline and re-envisioning corporate practices, the past year has called into question the very mission and purpose of serving on a board of directors. I'm looking forward to a dynamic conversation with today's experts as they touch upon some of these issues and more. I encourage you to interact with us during the session, and there are a few ways. To do that. We encourage you to use the chat feature throughout this discussion to share your thoughts with your fellow participants. We'll also have time for the audience questions at the end. You can use the Q&A feature if you'd like to ask one of the panelists a question. And you can also raise your hand. You can use the raise your hand feature if you'd like to ask a question to the speakers as well. If you use this option, we will unmute you so your audio capabilities are available and so that you can speak to your question to the panel. I'd also remind you, if you are not on mute, to put your phone and any other devices on silent so that it does not disrupt the conversation. Thanks again to you all for joining us today, and thank you to our panelists for taking the time out of your morning to share your insights with us. I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Lisa Walker, from DHR International, to kick off the discussion. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you for summarizing this morning's topic, which is so timely and so impactful. And it will be a joy to hear from our panelists as we talk about board governance and the role of the board advisory and directors. So I'd like to start with introductions. And first, Claudia Allen, would you please introduce yourself and tell us about the strengths of your background?
Sure, thank you, Lisa. I'm Claudia Allen. I'm a senior advisor with KPMG's Board Leadership Center, which is our think tank on corporate governance. And my background is as a corporate deal lawyer in private practice.
And Nicholas Cummings, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Nicholas Cummings. I'm the Deputy City Attorney for the City of Evanston, where I am now required to be a jack of all trades in terms of the law practice. And I'm also a member of the Board of Directors for the Cook County Bar Association, where this bar year I serve as the Financial Secretary.
Terrific. Simi Singh, can you talk?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Simi Singh, and I'm a senior partner with Aegon Zender here in the Chicago office, and I'm a full-time student of people. I do talent advisory work and work a lot with boards and CEOs, and delighted to be with you this morning.
So as you can see from our panelists, we have a mix, those who have served on boards, those who advise boards, and advisory from boards from very different angles. So again, feel free to send us your questions as we moderate what should be a very interactive conversation. But to kick this off, there's two topics we really want to delve into today. And that is, how has board advisory changed over the last 12 months, especially given the economic impact of COVID, as well as the impact of Black Lives Matter. Secondly, we will turn it over to get something actionable for each of our participants on this phone, or I should say on this Zoom, so we can talk about how each of you best position yourselves to be most effective with your clients. But to kick this off, Claudia, I'd like to turn it over to you. And you are a nationally recognized expert on corporate governance. And surely some of these trends are not a shock to you. They may be timing and there may be insights that even you are struggling to grasp. But could you talk to us about some of the social and economic impact that you've seen over the last 6 months and the impact on board advisory?
Well, thank you very much, Lisa. I think what we've seen is an acceleration and confluence of a number of trends that have been percolating for the last many years. For example, the focus on stakeholders, including employees, has jumped to the fore. That's also part of the focus on environmental, social, and governance issues as an economic and reputational imperative rather than as philanthropy or something soft. And we've also seen heightened engagement by boards in their work. And if we talk about stakeholders, I think the focus has to be on creating long-term value. And increasingly, there's a recognition that to create long-term value, the focus has to be on all of the key stakeholders of a corporation. That increasing share price is not the be-all and end-all when you're looking at the long term. And I think this is consistent with what the Business Roundtable came out and said last year. They talked about the need to create value for 5 stakeholder groups: employees, customers, suppliers, communities in which a corporation operates, as well as shareholders. And if we focus on one of those key groups, employees, I think employees as stakeholders have moved to the top of the list as a result of the crisis. Before the crisis, there was a lot of discussion of human capital management, issues like diversity, pay equity. As a result of COVID, employee health and well-being rocketed to the top of the list of issues almost every corporation was addressing, and that I don't think that's abated. At the same time, Black Lives Matter, social unrest, again focused on issues like equal opportunity in the workplace throughout the corporation, from the bottom to the top. So all these issues came together, and I think it would be a mistake to dismiss them as political or philosophical. These are issues that some of the largest institutional investors in the US, BlackRock, State Street, care about and will vote on. They vote with their feet on these issues. And then I think if we think about engagement of the board of directors, that's obviously also been something that's been increasing over time as the risk profile and businesses of companies have become more complex, and as the demands for the right skill sets to match a company's strategy have increased. And I think it's only been natural that that level of engagement is even heightened during the crisis, simply because business is changing so quickly and the board must be there to help management. So the duties are the same. You still have your oversight responsibilities, but as a practical matter, they're harder to discharge. You're meeting virtually. You have to figure out how to structure oversight of these risks. Some companies have used their standing committees, particularly audit and compensation. Others have formed ad hoc committees. And there's also been a struggle to get high quality information, which is the essence of what a board needs to ask good questions. So I think there's been an effort to balance the desire and need for information over a very constrained C-suite, which is managing a crisis day to day. So I think we've seen a lot of corporations try to find a creative way to get that information, sometimes through a periodic oral or written update from the CEO. And I think in exigent cases, we've seen boards say, we'll take the management reports rather than bespoke reports, because we recognize you don't have enough time and we want to get at the issues and help you. And so I think all of this, again, is about how do you get your arms around planning for the future, because I think the board, more than anybody else at a corporation, really needs to have the longest term view.
Thank you, Claudia. You covered a lot of ground there quickly. And Nicholas, now I want to turn it over to you. And you bring a very interesting perspective, the legal perspective, but also the board provider, service provider, as well as board representative. Could you share your perspective about how you think Black Lives Matter and COVID has changed the experience and the diversity that we need on our boards?
Sure, Lisa. First and foremost, I believe now there's a reckoning in terms of political will that's sort of driving what boards need in their diversity mix. So for example, in Illinois, we had House Bill 3394 that was passed. Ultimately, it was changed before it passed the Senate and was signed by the governor. But that bill originally required at least one African-American and one woman on your board, sort of putting diversity at the forefront and the requirement legally for a board mix. Ultimately, now it's only required that you report diversity numbers, but at least it signals that there is some political will and political winds changing with respect to that. Additionally, it brings a reckoning to some of our boards, and as a member of a board of directors for the Cook County Bar Association, that you need a mix of diversity in the corporate sense, not just a mix in terms of race, but also maybe generational diversity. It's important to have voices at the seat of the table in order to address these issues as organizations move forward to try and address them. And some may not be equipped to know how. And that's why it's important to have that mix with respect to generational, racial, educational, all those levels of diversity to be able to address those needs. And, really the boards at this point are trying to pivot, not only in the environment where we're meeting virtually and needing to understand how all of that technology works, but also trying to address those that me on a nonprofit, working with a nonprofit organization, how to address the needs of those that, may be looking for your services. So for example, with the Black Lives Matter movement and the various demonstrations around the country, whether, how our members can engage and provide legal services to individuals who may need them because of their civil rights may have been violated, or simply needing legal advice after they've been detained by police because of a demonstration. So all those things are sort of reflect why it's important to ensure that your board can be nimble and pivot quickly, and why that diversity mix is important.
Interesting. So Claudia, you pointed out the breadth of issues and impacts is only getting greater for the boards. And Nicholas, you pointed out the depth of experiences and perspectives that are needed, that hence the diversity to address those issues. So Simi, I get to give you the loaded question, which is from your perspective, what kinds of talent are boards seeking or lacking, even if they don't know it, to address this breadth and depth of solutions that they're going to need to face?
Right. Thank you, Lisa, and just wonderful comments by Claudia and Eric as well. I agree with so many of them. I guess I'll start with traits and then lead into talents, right? One of the most important roles for boards to play is governance is all about asking the right questions. And today, management teams have to have all the answers, and the best boards are leaning in to help ask the right questions, to help focus on the long haul while the management team is focusing on the short haul, and to be supportive without being overbearing. And so more than ever, the character of how you bring your thoughts to the table in support of the employees and support of the management team, with agendaless listening, leading with your humanity, and not just with performance, those changes and those traits, I think, are coming to the top in a very significant way. I believe with all of the societal upheaval that we have going on now, there is so much scar tissue and so much pain that's coming to the surface in our country, and it deserves so much more than tokenism. It deserves our true honesty. We need to bear witness to this moment that we're in with Black Lives Matter. We need to bear witness to the schism between the privileged and the underprivileged in our society, in my industry of healthcare, to social determinants of health. All of those elements, as you all pointed out, whether it's Blackstone speaking out about it, whether it's the Business Roundtable, the fact is that what were lists of things that were important to do have become the most important imperative of our time. And it's really, really important for boards to lead with humanity first. What that means in terms of talent, clearly diversity and inclusion is so important. Now, here's what's interesting, right? Traditionally, and you know this, Lisa, being an expert in our space as well, nearly 50 to 60% of our board searches have pivoted overnight to wanting to bring Black talent to the table, right? And I would say 6 months ago, they had already pivoted to 50 to 60% bringing women to the table. Now, the reality is 10% of our population is Black. No, and the truth is that if we are going to meet that demand, it is not because there's a lack of talent. It is because we have to change the prism with which we look at talent. Traditionally, we've said, you know, people have to be CEOs or they have to be CFOs to be considered. But actually, the extraordinary journey that someone may have gone through to become deputy general counsel and not general counsel, or become head of HR, as many people of color were moved into functional roles to succeed in terms of P&L roles, we have to be much, much more inclusive, because what we're looking for extraordinary talent, not necessarily a list of titles. So our prism has to expand. Our bar does not have to go lower. We have amazing talent in this country. It's just called different things. They are called different things. And then the reality becomes one of culture. So I think culture keepers and people who can really represent all the voices in the room, the voices of our customers, the voices of our employees, are going to become more important than ever in the boardroom. And so we have to think more than ever about the traits. There's clearly a lot of skills needed in the boardroom today. You know, strategic skills, because I think the contours of success are going to change so dramatically on the other side of this crisis that we can't be caught blindsided. Technology, and really, really understanding what that might mean. We're changing the way we're convening today tells us a lot about it. And, you know, really understanding millennials, understanding the next generation, understanding what it takes to motivate the next generation. And we have to most of all have those who have wisdom of years in the boardroom being able to mentor the new entrants who are diverse, but also being willing to be mentored by them on their points of view. And willing to learn and grow. So learn and grow is going to be probably one of the most important traits. I bring you an example of a place that I went to often for lunch, Chipotle, right? Chipotle has, you know, you walk into the average Chipotle and it's colors of the rainbow in terms of the employees and the customers. Chipotle today has an all-white board, right? And so that's a classic example. There are hundreds of companies like that that have to take the first step. So I would say most of all, the long answer to your question, Lisa, is we have to be really holistic in how we pick new board members, really thoughtful and humble in how we're willing to mentor and be mentored, and really inclusive in how we think, and not turn this into a quota system, but we must turn into a voice of the people in a way that we can truly be the perfect union that we all want to be at this moment.
Simi, I love your perspective, because it talks about, you know, we addressed a really big set of issues, and we addressed a need to go really deep to solve those issues. But we came back in many regards to what has always been, you know, the phrase American ingenuity. Sometimes we just need to think differently, and it's our collective thoughts that allow us to get there. And it's very promising to hear that come together. So that's encouraging, because now this conversation is going to segue to kind of a harder element, which is, given these situations, as panelists and with your expertise, I'd like to reach out and ask each of you to think through and to answer the question about how will we become better as service providers to the clients we serve. And Nicholas, I'm going to start with you this time. What do you think is one of the most often overlooked but most critical pieces of knowledge for those who advise boards? What can you talk to us about that?
Well, one of those things, and it's sort of tied to what Simi just mentioned, is a lack of awareness in terms of the resources available to find that other talent. So just as an example, the Chicago Urban League does a leadership development program for African Americans called Impact. It's in conjunction with the University of Chicago. And I'm actually a graduate of the fellowship myself this in 2020. And it prepares individuals who are already in leadership roles to be able to, if they got a call that for someone to serve on a board, whether it be a nonprofit or hopefully in the corporate boardroom. But the other things in terms of being a better service provider, in terms of not only being aware of those other pools of engagement, is understanding what's coming down the pipeline, understanding that right now we are in a position of, you know, it's an election year. We're in a position of potential political change. we see that the generations Y and Z are very vocal about what it is that they want. And so as a service provider just to a board, you have to be able to advise your board as to what's coming next. And that means even to, as a service provider, being able to diversify even your own organization, because those voices and ideas will help inform your clients in a sense that they can be able to see what's coming and what's on the way. I'm sure that as Claudia talked about at the very beginning, and as Simi even mentioned, there was some pressure on boards to diversify, either being women, African Americans. We discussed earlier about in Illinois how the General Assembly even wanted to make it a requirement. But knowing what's coming and knowing what's on the way politically and legally will definitely give you a leg up in terms of providing answers to your clients.
Right. Yeah, that important link of the politics into the business, so that we are addressing, as Claudia said, the 5 key stakeholders. Now, Simi, I'm going to turn it over to you, and building on Nicholas's thoughts of adding that political agenda, but also what you mentioned, so important, is the learning and growing. You said it's so important that leadership be learning and growing. And I think of that as we look at the agenda, or we look at that next phase. What is that, that practice of learning and growing, or the agenda-less approach look like, and how do we practice it?
Thank you, Lisa, and for your comments, Eric. I think, one of these podcasts that I've been listening to, right, during this whole period, 99PI, it's 99% invisible. What's really interesting about it is it's about architectural and design elements that surround us that we don't even think about, that actually really, really influence our lives. And some of them are funny and some of them are interesting. But this whole idea of what's hiding in plain sight is really, really important. And I think what's critical that boards need to do in terms of learning and growing is being able to look at what's hiding in plain sight. It is also really focusing on growth, which is build of the pipeline. Right now we're in this land grab for people that suit the contours of what we wanted, right? In some senses, the one extreme is we're looking for a board member that looks exactly like us, whose skin color happens to be convenient. I say this humbly with humility as a person of color, and as a sister to my Black brothers and sisters and others. But on the other hand, the truth is that diversity requires us to grow. It requires us to learn. It requires us to think about building the pipeline. It requires us to deal with the consequences of the LGBTQ members and the others. And to be honest, just because one of us, is Caucasian doesn't mean we're completely not different in how we are, right, from others. And so I think growing into inclusion and learning about how to listen, and how to listen without an agenda and listen without our traditional prisms, is the challenge of a lifetime. And it's really, really critical and enormously rewarding. And there are many ways to do that. One of the board members that I'm very close to, who chairs multiple committees, built a multi-billion-dollar company, is this wonderful, Caucasian gentleman. And he has had a practice for the last 5 years, which is something I've had as well, which is that each of us picks a mentor who's under 30 each year. And we're mentored by millennials, by Gen X people. And we both decided, 2 years ago that we each wanted to have a diverse mentor and a Black mentor. And so what's interesting today, it's become more important than ever. So I would say, look upward, yes. Look at your peer group, yes. But more than important, learn and grow from the next generation. I think our mentors need to get younger and wiser, and what we learn from each other in the spirit of the Brothers and Sisters program, in the spirit of so many others, is going to be invaluable. But it really all is listen harder than you ever have before, and listen with the spirit of 99PI, which is look for design principles in plain sight that are going to change the architecture of how we lead in the future.
Excellent. Very insightful. Thank you. And now, Claudia, we've teed up a lot of issues, and we know change, and actually we know active listening can be very difficult. And when you're approaching a new client, it's got to be very difficult to understand who they are, how they react, and where they are on this paradigm. So could you give us some counsel as when you're starting out with a new client? How do you address these issues?
I think that humility is obviously important, and I think the place to start is to educate yourself. Read whatever you can about the company, learn about the individual members of management, read up on the board, try to understand the challenges the company is facing as well as its industry. And as Simi said, it's very important to go in and listen very carefully, because it's not just the words that are said, it's also it's also the dynamics of the board that can be so important to understand. I mean, if you can be briefed in advance about the board dynamics, that's invaluable, because there are clearly certain people in the room on specific issues you need to speak to. And so when you go in and you talk to a board, you're bringing a third-party perspective. If you understand those dynamics, there's a greater likelihood you'll be listened to. And again, the humility in you don't want to provide a canned answer. You want to understand the company and provide bespoke advice. And I think that's the best way to be listened to and valued.
Very helpful. Now I'm going to turn and address the audience and ask you guys to tee up some questions for us. We know that we're a smart group up here, but we know that you're probably even smarter. And so if you can hit that Q&A button and hit us with a few questions, we'd be very pleased to hear from you. But while our audience does that over there, maybe second cup of coffee, Simi, I want to turn it back over to you, because that role of listening and even the role that we've talked about of managing established boards, we are faced now with many, and luckily here in the Chicagoland area, a great tech and a great startup and innovative environment where we have many companies looking to build their boards or even create a board. How do you go about advising those boards and helping them set the structure in place?
You know, I think very much as picking up on what Claudia said, Lisa, it is really about figuring out what the actual need is, right? Because it never fails to impress me how bespoke the process really needs to be. It's all about where the company is at that moment of time, where the founders or the CEOs are at that moment of time, and the management teams in terms of discovery. I think the most important element, I would say, though is about balance. You want to make sure that you're not looking to just solve an advisory problem. Sometimes, particularly young boards, they're looking for an expert. You know, I have to pivot with technology, go and find me a technology person. My question always is that person better as a member of your management team, as a member of an advisory board, or is that who you want to put on your company board, right? Because board members have to bring expertise, yes, but they have to bring wisdom. They have to bring a collective ethos to the room to really amplify the effectiveness of the other members of your board. And they have to be able to really help complement the talent skills. So we're very, very fanatical, I would say, about fit, which is how do you fit the long-term strategy? How do you really move the ball forward? In terms of looking, we are really, and on the supply side. So on the demand side, you want to be very thoughtful and multi-layered. On the supply side, we work incredibly hard to mentor that and to help the next generation tell their story. One of the most rewarding things to me is meeting with young executives or older executives who are thinking about their retirement or at any stage of their career. And I love it when people start thinking 5 years in advance about how do I enter the fray? How do I tell my story? How do I build the network? How do I get into the boardroom? There is an art form to all of it. And sharing that and being open with it, as opposed to having it happen behind the scenes in the halls of the connected, is really critical. And that's something that's enormously rewarding. I've loved seeing the natural sharing and openness that comes in the tech community and in entrepreneurial companies. Steve Collins at Matter, shout out to him, does an amazing job in healthcare and convening people and convening teams. But I would say be open, be transparent, embrace the opportunity to teach and learn, which is so critical at that time. And remember to be bespoke and not narrow-minded in emphasizing one factor over the others. A qualified board member is so much more important than someone who brings an incredible expertise into the room, but doesn't contribute in other ways.
Very good points. Thank you, Simi. And we do have an audience, Lindsay Zane, who's going to pop on this video and ask her question. While Lindsay gets on board, I'm going to just take a minute and mention what Fred Sigmund shared with all the participants, that there are some great resources out there for board candidates. And since 2003, Chicago United has recognized that and has put together a list of 400 leaders, and there is a link on your Q&A panel if anyone wants to copy that and make sure they have that. So there are definitely resources, as Simi, Claudia, and Nicholas have mentioned. There are resources to get diversity. This list right here, as well as folks who've heard of Chicago Blend, that's another list that as a recruiter I may know of, and some of you may know of as well, that has a real focus on diversity as well as female diversity. So, so that point, and great to see your face, Lindsay. Let me turn the microphone over to you, and you can jump in with your question.
Sure. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for the panel. It's all great information. And myself, I had a CFO background, and I recently focused a lot on the corporate governance research. So I had a chance to talk with many corporate board members and business leaders from different aspects. I think after the the panel discussion, I'd like to ask one question. Claudia mentioned about during this COVID-19 crisis, a lot of the board focus has been escalated, and the board members' engagement also being increased. And I do see many board members has to spend more time than before with board meeting or help the management solve the problems or put together new strategic plans for long-term and short-term strategy. Do you see this will be a trend moving forward? Like after the COVID, what kind of the situation, like what kind of engagement the board has today will stay? Because if this is a long-term permanent engagement, that will require more time and effort from the board member, because that will lead to another question. Because today, most board members are has their full-time job, only serve the board as a side job or part-time. And so if the engagement or effort needed from the board member increased, so do you see the trend for the board structure change in moving forward? Then we might have to have more independent board who can have enough effort and time to help the company. And we might have to ask board members limit their involvement with the board. Like before, people might serve on 3-5 board, now maybe focus on 1 or 2. Would that be a new trend moving forward? That's my question. Thank you.
Well, if I could take that one, I mean, I do think already there is a desire on the part of institutional investors to limit how many boards an individual serves on. And I think that makes sense because there is a heightened time commitment. But I would say if somebody's going to take a board seat, you know going in, a company is going to have at least one crisis and probably many crises. And so you have to make sure that you have the bandwidth to be there in times of crises. You know, as a practical matter, I think the worst thing a director can do in most cases is bail at the time of a crisis. So you have to make sure you have that time. I think the workload waxes and wanes. I do think there are likely to be some permanent knock-on effects of what we're going through now. I don't think we'll always need as intense a level of engagement, but I think there is probably going to be a move toward more real-time engagement. So a combination of regular board meetings combined with some virtual ones or other check-ins. I mean, that's something that was highlighted in last year's Blue Ribbon Commission report from the National Association of Corporate Directors. I was one of the commissioners for that. And I do think that is going to be a trend, because when a board stays engaged and up to date, it makes the formal meetings more efficient. It allows them to be time to address issues, talk with management, rather than just updating. So I think that would be my response to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lindsay, and very good point. And Ashley Carrington has asked the question of the panelists, what are ways that companies are looking to find new board members? And certainly, Simi, you can speak on that from an executive search perspective. So I'd like to have you talk on that. And then Claudia, if there's any addition, please jump in, or Nicholas, but Simi, over to you.
Right. So what are ways in which we're looking, right, was the question for new board members? I would say, it's a really good question. I think search strategy is incredibly critical. One has to be, in some ways things have not changed because the best way of doing board searches should always have been incredibly inclusive and specific. But as I had said before, I think the important thing is that we're looking more differently. It's not just about titles, but there's a new emphasis and a very much well-deserved emphasis that the slates be balanced between traditional profiles and non-traditional profiles, whether they're non-traditional by title, whether they're non-traditional because it's a stretch assignment or it's somebody's first board. It's really interesting. So many of the women, for example, in my network who have gotten multiple boards, they say they get a call a week for a new board member, right? For a new board assignment that they don't have capacity for. And yet there are so many others that really want those calls. So one of the things we encourage people to say is, look, chances are you'll get a call directly from me or Lisa or other search members, but please network and to other members who are within the know, because they may tell you of a search. A lot of the time, someone tells me about a mentee that they have or someone that they really believe in. I always have conversations with experienced board members to say, who do you know in the pipeline that's particularly gifted? The second is that we're speaking a lot with the top CEOs in the country who are in many cases deeply committed to releasing their management team members to serve on boards in ways that they might not have in the past. So I would say paying particular attention to the development of the pipeline is important. Paying particular attention to looking in non-traditional ways is important. Sourcing is important. And then, really thinking about being holistic in the definition of the board member. But at the end of the day, it's all about making sure that it's not just who you know, but how you look that counts.
Right, and that's a topic for a whole list of boards, a board conversation about the qualifications of a board member. So that we could take on for quite some time. But I want to stay on that topic of board participation. And Claudia, I'm going to push this over to you. The comment was asked, or the question was asked by one of our members, that many boards have subcommittees where they do get input from people of color and other diverse, I'll call it executives or points of view. Are these folks counted in the diversity numbers when they look at board participation? Or how does that subcommittee participation get counted in the broader board participation, especially when it relates to diversity statistics? Do you have any insights that you can share?
Well, I think if you're talking about a public company board, the committees are solely composed of directors. There may be some combination management director committees like an executive committee, but any subcommittees also are going to be solely directors. I think in the not-for-profit world, you sometimes see combinations of directors and other individuals. And to the extent those are counted, I don't think they're really very good statistics on that. We also can see people on advisory boards. And again, I think once you're outside the public realm, the statistics are fairly weak because it's so hard to collect the data.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that role of the board members is a very demanding job. So we can't tell, it's not just exciting to be on a board member, it's also demanding. You have to take the good with the bad. So audience, please feel free to jump in with some additional questions. I appreciate that. And once again, Fred Sigmund has provided some additional resources regarding private companies and boards. So feel free to click on your Q&A and check out that link. But this is a question from Grant Bruce, and he'd like to ask the question, for individuals that would like to join a board in the future, what resources do you recommend? So Sini, let me actually tee that up and have you start with that as an executive recruiter. And again, Nicholas, if you have any additional insights, or Claudia, let's cover that.
Right, so it's what resources I'd recommend in terms of wanting to serve on a board and how you can think about it.
And how you, I think, probably prepare to be on a board.
Exactly. So, you know, I think those are such important questions. First of all, how you prepare, some of it is building your story, and some of it is how you tell your story. I think it's really, really critical to give yourself the benefit of time. A lot of people sort of say, you know, I want to get on a board in the next year. And I would say the real question is, how do I prepare to be an outstanding board member? What fits my profile? What are the spikes that I have? What is my identity and motivation? And how do I tell my story? So I would say, be your own mentor and be your own best customer, and take a really unvarnished look at your skills, at your spikes, at what differentiates you, and then really, really think about how to prepare yourself. The second thing is that it's a question of, you know, first of all, really get into the job, right? For those of us who have the benefit of having working with public boards, we understand the structures, we understand the committees, we understand how all of that works. Take classes in governance, you know, school yourself, share that with people that you're preparing. I would say if you're an executive who's planning for retirement and would like to be on a board in the next couple of years, you know, Stanford, University of Chicago, put on these really wonderful institutes on governance. So one, educate yourself formally and semi-formally, find a mentor, be realistic about your expectations and be multifaceted. The other that I often hear is, you know, when boards look for board members, and particularly boards of scale, they look for long-term commitment. That point that Claudia made is really important, which is you don't like board members who bail when the things get tough. And know that if you know, have been on the boards of a couple of companies for a year as an expert before they exit, people are not going to see that as governance experience. They're going to see that as an expert who vaulted in at a time that the company needed you. And so remember that if you take on a board commitment, stay with the board for the long haul and make sure that the work that you're doing is training you for a career or contributions in governance and not just an expertise. And then finally, when it comes to telling your story, always put yourself on the side of the table of the person asking the questions. It's not about wanting to impress them with all the things that you've done. It's wanting to connect with them on what their need might be. So this isn't about selling ourselves for an executive role. It's completely about listening and engaging in how you can be accretive. And that means every word counts. Think really carefully about telling your story. Board recruiting and being a board candidate is hugely different from pitching yourself in a marketing situation. And it's very, very interesting to see how seasoned members do that. So it's mindset, it's training, it's preparedness, it's self-awareness, humility, and confidence. And it's seriously creative networking, not just with headhunters, but with all of the people who get all of the calls and who are willing to pass them on. I would honestly tell you, your first board will very often come as a hand-me-down lead from somebody who got too many calls, as it might from a direct call. Embrace those opportunities as much as you get to know folks like us who are in the business.
And Nicholas, can I turn it over to you? Because you've been active on boards and you really have perspective on what boards are looking for.
So I would say for Grant's question, it may seem silly, but practice in governance, meaning if you have an area in which you have interest, find a nonprofit that serves in that area, and to find out if they are looking for to increase their ranks in terms of their board of directors. And having that experience in governing before going to a corporate board or some sort of private company to be on their board of directors, I think is invaluable experience, because you know sort of rules and procedures on how votes work. I mean, it may seem silly, but knowing the mechanics of how all that works, getting a feel for how sometimes they become political, and not necessarily political in the sense of like a national conversation, but who's allied with whom in the room to get things done. Being able to gain that experience has been can be, and I think would be helpful in terms of a resource to gain that knowledge. Insofar as what boards may be looking for, and I did, there was a question that came up, I think it was Ashley asked the question with respect to resources to find out when boards are looking or how to get on those boards. And I think Simi sort of hit it on the head, and this is Chicago after all. It comes down to who you know oftentimes, and that can be unfortunate, but it's about building that pipeline and having mentors. So if that pipeline is built and you have mentors in place, they can be able to tee you up and say, well, I know someone. And suddenly the next thing you know, you are involved in a recruiting process to become part of a board of directors. I think insofar as what boards may be looking for in terms of talent, it really comes down to that, and I really hate to overuse the word, but it's diversity, whether it be generational wisdom, gender, racial diversity. We need people with a confluence of ideas. I know that serving for the Cook County Bar Association, it is very sort of narrow in terms of the focus of the board. I mean, it's the largest, and the oldest bar association for African-American lawyers. So the board of directors tends to reflect African-American attorneys. So all of us are either attorneys or judges that are Black. But it does range in terms of, we have, representation from LGBTQ. We have representation from each level in terms of generation. People have been practicing less than 10 years. In fact, one of our vice presidents actually has been practicing less than 10 years. So it is important to be able to have that, not only sort of a pipeline in terms of developing that talent, but understanding that those people can still provide, good ideas in terms of the direction of the board, especially as times are changing, as we see with COVID-19 and our political push to value Black life.
Lisa, if I could add something, I think it's also important, if you're a member of a minority group or a woman, there are some good affinity groups that can be helpful with networking. We do a lot of work with Latino corporate directors, women corporate directors, Quorum, which is a group for LGBTQ individuals. And then there are groups like Equilar, which maintain pretty robust databases of almost everybody who's ever served on a public company as a senior executive or as a director. So I think, networking within those groups, getting yourself into databases. And I think the other thing is give yourself enough runway. When I was practicing law, everybody would say, I want to retire and become a law professor. Well, that's very unlikely unless you've laid the groundwork. And I think it's the same for being a corporate director. You have to lay the groundwork and recognize it's going to take time. And for the vast majority of people, you're not going to end up on an S&P 500 board. You have to be realistic about your qualifications and where you might best to add value.
Very good points. And we have segued from the core of the change and how that's the change due to COVID, the economic implications, as well as the Black Lives Matter. So this is exactly what we wanted to do with this audience participation. So please, if you've got another question, either on this topic or back over to the core, jump right in. This is what this Zoom is all about.
Lisa, there was a question that came up about reporting, and I can't remember who asked it. I believe it was Rona was asking if boards involve people of color on subcommittees that are not technically on the board and whether they should be counted. And I wanted to get an opportunity to address that, if that's okay.
Please.
I can't say that it's for certain that they are required to count those numbers, but I think it's a slippery slope in terms of allowing organizations to count those subgroups or those subcommittees or associate boards toward their diversity requirement. I know, like I pointed out earlier, Illinois has a requirement for reporting, and essentially instead of having boards be forced to diversify from a legal perspective, they're now, for lack of a better term, a way to describe it, shaming organizations into saying exactly how not diverse they are by having this report with the Secretary of State. And I think allowing them to count diversity numbers on associate boards that don't have the same voice when it comes to governance can be a slippery slope because it becomes tokenism, as Simi mentioned earlier. And I can't say if it is required to count them, but I don't know if they should be able to, because it doesn't actually meet the goal that we're trying to achieve in terms of diversifying the boardroom itself.
Well, I think we are about wrapped up. I think I get the last say here on questions, and I'm going to wrap up with each of our panelists. And I've got a 2-part question in closing. I'd like each of you to tell me the best piece of advice that you have shared with your client this year. And then I'd also like to give every audience member here a piece of advice on a book, a summer read, a podcast, or a binge watch that you have enjoyed. So a professional piece of advice and then a personal piece of advice. And I'm gonna shake it up a little bit and go backwards here. So Simi, can I start with you?
Sure. I think, you know, I would probably say the professional piece of advice that I have asked so many of my colleagues and clients and board members to really think about is that when we vet people, you know, interviewing is traditionally a process where the risk is high and the trust is low initially, right? And when parties are meeting across video and sometimes making huge hiring decisions without meeting in person until the very end or not at all. What I have said to everyone is that in virtual interactions with candidates, do not lead with the search, do not lead as a client and a candidate. I need you to be human first. And for the first 15 minutes, you cannot have a work discussion. You have to have a human-to-human discussion. And that means no fake Zoom backgrounds. If you're most comfortable in your home sitting on the piano bench because you're struggling to teach yourself piano, even though you're very successful, then sit on the piano bench and talk about it. I've had, you know, a 70-year-old founder who was doing succession, who was really uncomfortable with virtual. She ended up taking her successor around her garden for 2 hours, talking about pruning and talking about branches and talking about trees. You know, I've had folks do video meals with their spouses. So I think most of it has been in virtual interactions, get to know the human on the other side. You can touch each other's hearts, even if you can't shake each other's hands, and you can feed each other's humanity. And once you do that, your virtual interactions can feel far less synthetic than they could be. So that's sort of been a critical one. I shared 99PI, which was the podcast that I was talking about, which was really cool. But the other thing I've been doing, which is a favorite topic of mine, my mother taught history, is really going back and studying the Tudor era in great detail in the courts of Henry VIII. Because, you know, Henry was a really young leader facing unprecedented challenges that he had never heard of before, with no real mentor, and was faced with impossible opportunity, amazing opportunity, and to him, unimaginable and crushing constraints. And I think it's a metaphor for where we are today, where as corporate leaders, as board members, the Black Plague was followed by the Renaissance. The Spanish flu was followed by the Roaring 20s. There is unprecedented opportunity ahead. And we are brand new to it because the contours of success will completely change. And we feel unimaginably constrained, jailed in our houses like political dissidents. And I actually think we ought to learn a lot from Henry on what he messed up and what he did right. So that's what I'm reading.
Fantastic. And that's the first time I've heard that advice all summer, and I'm going to follow it. So thank you.
Sure.
Nicholas, over to you.
You know, it's very difficult to try and identify the best piece of advice I've given my clients this year. I represent the city of Evanston, and my clients tend to be city council. So it's very difficult to identify the best piece of advice because the majority of the time that I spend is actually giving advice on a regular basis. But I will say that, you know, advising politicians is always an interesting area because they obviously care deeply about their constituents, but you have to keep in mind that you have a duty or an obligation to the actual entity, the city itself. And so that's the advice that I often give is sometimes not to do something. And that's usually what I will say is probably the best piece of advice that I can say that I've given this year is that's probably not something you want to do, or it's definitely something you don't want to engage in. Don't engage in that particular area. And I can't say that it's always followed, but it is probably the best piece of advice that I can say that I've given this year. With respect to reading or podcasts or binge watching, I read way too much case law to read books for pleasure. So I will say that I did have an opportunity to rewatch The Office and Parks and Recreation during our shelter-in-place time, and it's really interesting because The Office sort of tapers off before we get to the more modern time that we're in now. I think it stopped airing around 2015 or 2016. But a lot of the issues that you see now that our board would have to deal with were actually very prominent in the early seasons of The Office. And the idea, I think even Steve Carell said, that show would not be able to air now because of some of the things that they were, doing or dealing with early on in those seasons. And there's another podcast that I will say is In the Dark. My former corporation counsel at the Chicago Transit Authority put me onto that podcast. And this particular season is talking about coronavirus and the Delta, which is in the southern region of the United States. And it's often forgotten, especially when you talk about political discussion. But it looks at the reporting about what's going on in terms of how people are reacting with respect to not being able to go to church, how it's impacting prisons like Parchment prisons, which is one of the most notorious prisons in the United States. So that would be a couple of things that I would encourage people to either watch or listen to.
Fantastic. That is, I like that as well, bringing us back domestically and all we have going on. That's important. Claudia, over to you.
I think it's important when you're talking to the director community to emphasize the importance of digging in to understand the changing risk profile of a company and the business itself. I mean, we recently surveyed directors, and a very large percentage, about 40%, said they believe they didn't adequately understand the business or the risk profile. And I think understanding those as best you can is fairly elemental to being able to ask good questions and look at the long term. Because if you don't understand the present, how are you going to plan for the future? So sometimes it really is the basics. And then in terms of a good read, I would highly recommend A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles. I think it's a great book for our time in which we live in a quarantined environment. So it resonated quite deeply with me.
Very good. Thank you, Claudia. Fantastic. So I want to thank all our panelists, and then I most importantly want to turn it over to John Roddy, who will take it from here.
Great. Thanks, Lisa, and good morning, everyone. My name is John Roddy. I am the partner in charge of KPMG's audit practice in Chicago. I also lead KPMG's Audit Committee Institute, which is part of our Board Leadership Center, and of course, a proud sponsor of this forum. What a great discussion we just had. If you'd all please join me in a virtual round of applause for our great panelists, Simi, Nicholas, Claudia, and Lisa. Great job moderating. Given my role at KPMG, I've seen a fair amount of disruption in board governance and oversight over the years, and probably none of that is more striking than right now with boards dealing with everything on their agenda. And we talked about some really important topics today. We talked about the intense focus on stakeholders, focusing on the employees, ESG as an imperative, not just a nice to have, the need for boards to be nimble and pivot and show humanity. What a great word that Simi used as circumstances change quickly. And also some great reminders on listening, the importance of mentoring, and bringing that authenticity as a board member in a very bespoke manner. We hope that this conversation was informative and helpful for everyone. Please keep an eye on the Executive Club's website for more upcoming virtual programs. In particular, we hope you can join us on August 25th for a talk about the future of our workplace with real estate experts from Salesforce, Convene, Finders Plus, and JLL. Hope everyone has a great rest of the day. Thanks for joining us, and hope to see you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.